Welcome to the latest episode of In the Interim. I'm Bruce Mueller. I'm Interim Dean at the College of Pharmacy here at the University of Michigan. And I'm really happy to have a friend of the college and faculty member of the college and administrator of the college, Dean Paul Walker, who is our guest for this really important episode of In the Interim. Dean Walker he's a clinical professor at the University of Michigan. He's assistant dean of experiential education and community engagement, but he's also a manager in the Department of Pharmacy at Michigan Medicine. I invited Dean Walker in for our In the Interim here because he's currently serving as three-year term on the executive board of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. But even more importantly, he is serving as the chair and board liaison to the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, or ASHP's, Task Force on Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I wanted to talk about that process with Dean Walker because it's really an important issue, and it's not something that we've talked about nearly enough in pharmacy in general. And so I wanted to have that meeting with us today. I want to invite the audience to participate and ask as many questions as they would like to ask. There's a Q&A feature that you can use. There is also a chat feature if you'd like to use that, because I'd really like to pick the brain of Dr. Walker. Thanks for being on the program. I think you might be muted, so let's jump right into this.
There we go. Thanks, Bruce. Happy to be here.
We're on the air. I got my red on the air sign on, so we're official now.
Great.
You know, just to kind of get started on this, so you're really an active person with an ASHP, and maybe we could do another program someday about how to get involved in really national organizations and make a difference beyond just the patients in front of you that you're taking care of, but really a national effort like this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I think, engagement with professional associations is an important responsibility that pharmacists bear. And to be honest with you, being engaged with professional associations, ASHP primarily, but also the Michigan Pharmacists Association and the Michigan Society of Health System Pharmacists. Engagement with these groups has been one of the most professionally rewarding things that I've been involved in over the last 30 plus years.
Yeah, and you've been active in all of those organizations. And one of the things that I want to do here is on the chat, we've put down the draft recommendations that ASHP has come up with, and we'll walk through those. But as we were talking off the air, these are not the latest recommendations. Where are we with the publication of these recommendations?
That's correct. We have gone through a sort of an iterative process in developing these recommendations. The task force actually started its work last August. And to be honest with you, we did some, I think, pretty good work pretty quickly. We released this draft that is available on the ASHP website back in late November. And since that time, we have solicited input from the organization. We released an all-member survey that we sent out to our 58,000 plus members. We received quite a number of responses with input. And we also held a town hall meeting at the mid-year clinical meeting last December, where we introduced the draft. We talked about the recommendations, how they were developed, and we solicited input from about 650 people who were in attendance. And based on their feedback, the task force has gone back and made revisions to the draft. And we submitted that final copy to the board of directors end of January. That draft has now been approved, and it should be published and available to our constituency as well as the pharmacy community at large and others, hopefully this week or early next.
All right, so this is ahead of print. Before it even gets out there to the public, you're getting a sneak peek here if you're in this program. I think we should
Although there were a few significant changes to the draft that you currently have access to.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's start first. I think we really need to start with, and that is, why did ASHP put this to the front? Why was this something that should be done and be done now?
Well, I think there were a lot of significant events that happened last year that have prompted not just ASHP, but a lot of other organizations, including healthcare professions organizations, to look at their stance on various issues, to look within their organizations, to see what issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion might exist, and to identify opportunities to make improvements in the area of DEI. The death of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others at the hands of the police highlighted the issue of police brutality as a public health issue, particularly affecting, and I would say affecting disproportionately, communities of color. And also the COVID pandemic. As you all know, if you followed any of the statistics, it disproportionately affects people of color in terms of the prevalence, the incidence of the disease among Blacks and Hispanics, as well as the mortality rates. And I recently saw some statistics that suggested that the post-COVID sequelae are more prevalent in people of color as well. So there's there are lots of disparities in healthcare outcomes that were highlighted by the events of last year. And so ASHP felt some urgency to address this issue. It's really interesting because in June of last year at our House of Delegates, some delegates brought a statement for policy consideration to the House of Delegates that decried racism, structural racism, as a problem, and that it is unacceptable and has no social value, which I think is a pretty powerful statement for the organization to make. And at our June board meeting last year, the board of directors decided that this was significant enough of an issue that we really needed to take a look at our past efforts to address issues of DEI and where we might have opportunity to make some changes throughout our organization to help improve the diversity of our organization, as well as address healthcare disparities and some of the inequities that exist in society. So that's what led us to convene the task force.
So you covered a lot of things there. There's this societal racism aspect that you talked about, then the health disparities aspect, which we're aware of, and we're trying to, even in our own curriculum, try to have more information about this. And then you drilled it down to ASHP itself and pharmacy and the profession of pharmacy.
Yeah.
And particularly that latter one, I don't know that that's been discussed very much at all. I mean, we teach students about healthcare disparities. We see it with our own eyes. We talk about access to care. We talk about, you brought up the COVID example of even vaccination rates and access to vaccinations and willingness to get a vaccination, and race plays a role in this. And we could talk more about that, but the fact that we don't talk about, like, what does this have to do with pharmacists besides the delivery of their job,
Yeah, well, I think it's something that we need to talk about. Now, I think I first need to state that I am not an expert in issues of structural racism. There are people who make their careers out of studying that kind of stuff and doing research and publishing. But I think we need to accept that structural racism exists. And that has impact on us as healthcare professionals. We may not have pulled it all the way through as a thought to consider what are the implications to us as a profession, but I think there's some things that we can highlight. And so, structural racism really impacts the social determinants of health. It affects access to education. It affects jobs. It affects access to good paying jobs and financial wellness and health. It affects the distribution of healthcare resources throughout the community. It impacts a lot of the social determinants of health that impact healthcare outcomes. And as pharmacy continues to become a very clinical profession with patient care as our focus, we need to think about how these SDSs, or these social determinants of health, impact our patients and how we might be able to make some changes. There's a couple of things that I could highlight that I think are important. We tend to think of the distribution of clinics and hospitals and things like that, and how people have access to quality healthcare or not through those venues. But there are some data, and granted, they're a little bit old, 8, 10, 12 years old, but they've looked at the distribution of pharmacies and how that's impacted by structural racism. And there's evidence to suggest that there is significant disparity in how pharmacies are placed, how they're built throughout our communities, with white communities having much more or many more stores than predominantly Black communities. There's research and a discussion of medication deserts, if you will, in the literature that are analogous to the food deserts that we talk about, when we talk about people's access to nutritious food and things of that nature. And that suggests that there are some limitations on access to medications. So that's one issue that impacts pharmacy. These same studies look at access to commonly prescribed medications and stock outages and things like that. And they demonstrate disparity between white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods. Some of that, of course, might be impacted by the lack of health insurance that covers prescriptions, or underinsurance that doesn't adequately cover medications. But the fact is, those kinds of things exist. And our own faculty, like Steve Erickson and Sarah Vordenberg, have published about pharmacist vaccine services and how they vary by zip code, which is impacted by social determinants of health, i.e. impacted by structural racism. So the availability of pharmacies is an important issue. And is that something that we can help to address through policy, through advocacy, to help improve access to pharmacist services? And I could go on. I don't know if you want to ask a question.
Well, no, I mean, even I remember when opiates were the top of mind topic. There were stores in certain neighborhoods that just didn't carry opiates. And if you had pain, you got pain, and you weren't going to be treated appropriately.
And part of that is attitudes about addiction and substance use disorder and its prevalence in different communities. And some of it is due to misperceptions that could arise from structural racist ideas. So opiates is just one category. High cost medications, access to, we could say, statins, or access to insulin and things like that, which most people might not think about, but could significantly impact access of these different populations to medications. And so I think that's an important thing for us to think about. I think it's also important for us to think about the adverse health outcomes that differ by race. We can look at the literature that clearly establishes difference in cardiovascular and stroke outcomes, with mortality being 30 times higher in Blacks compared to non-Blacks, or stroke mortality being 45% higher among Blacks compared to non-Blacks. That's not all genetics. A lot of that is social determinants of health. And I appreciate that morbidity and mortality outcomes are complex, but are there some things that we as pharmacists can do to help improve those outcomes? Can we make sure that patients are on the right medication regimens? Can we recognize that certain populations may have the right meds underprescribed? And can we impact that at all? Can we impact patients through education and help them to play a bigger role in their own care? How can we impact medication adherence? I think there's some real good questions that pharmacists can ask about how can I help these patients have better outcomes through the skill set that I have and the knowledge that I have. We could ask similar questions about diabetes. We can ask similar questions about obesity and other diseases that are that have disparate outcomes based on race. So I think those are some important things to think about.
No, and I think you put your hand right on it, and that is that pharmacists can affect these outcomes, and that's the exciting thing, and we're really hoping that our students will do that. The issue of racism is a tough issue, particularly in the political climate we've just lived through for the last 4 years. And I want to just ask something a little different, and that is, it took courage, I think, for ASHP to take this on. Although you could argue if they didn't do it, they had to do it. I mean, they sort of had. They are really the leading organization. But I want to talk about your leadership through this. I mean, this is, people talk about herding cats. I mean, you've got people with ideologies and ideas that are all over the place. I sat in on that meeting when you presented it, and there were people with all kinds of different ideas on how to address race or whether we should address race at all. Personally, how did you lead this group through a minefield and actually very quickly with I think outstanding recommendations that we could talk about what some of them are, but how did you what was your thought process as you decided to go through this? First, you must have thought you were crazy or you were really excited to do it. I don't know which one, but talk us through some of this.
Well, I think what you heard at the town hall were questions from a different audience than the task force. The task force was primarily comprised of Black ASHP members, and all of them were leaders in their own right. We had a dean of a College of Pharmacy at an HBCU. We had a former ASHP president. And there's only been 2 Black ASHP presidents. One of them is dead, so you can probably figure out who the other one is pretty easily. We had a member of the ASHP Foundation, because if we wanted any kind of funding to support research or projects, we wanted to make sure that they were on board. We had leaders from every sphere of health system practice, including a person from JACO. Most of the members were Black, but all were not. We did have some Hispanic representation on the task force. And then Tom Johnson, who's the current ASHP president, as well as Paul Abramowitz, who is our CEO. And so that comprised the group. I think there were close to 20 of us on the task force. And actually, we had a lot of really good discussion, and my job was to keep them focused on the outcomes, focused on the objectives, but let them do their work to identify gaps and to identify what are the issues that Black pharmacists are facing within our society as well as within our profession. And what are the issues at large in society that we might be able to impact to improve diversity in our profession. So, they were pretty focused, and very rarely did I have to rein people in. They were very cooperative. They worked really well together as teams. We broke up into 3 work groups around some focused areas. We addressed issues of governance, which relates to our board of directors, our House of Delegates, our committees, and our forums, and other work groups within the organization. We looked at education, we looked at our publications and marketing resources and approaches. We looked at research and advocacy, about 6 different areas. And they worked pretty well together.
But did you go into it with what did you, when you went into this, I kind of want to, what did you think the outcomes were going to be, or what was the prize that you saw at the end that you were going to be working? I kind of want to get into your head a little bit about how you thought this through.
Well, I wanted our organization to have more diverse leadership. How do we engage more underrepresented minorities in leadership within the organization? And that's all the way through. How do we get more underrepresented minorities? And I should say that our charge was to really come up with recommendations that would impact Black Americans within our organization and in society at large. But as we worked through our recommendations, we recognized that other communities of color could be impacted significantly and supported through the recommendations as well. And so the language that we use throughout the document is BIPOC for I just blanked on
Black, Indigenous, people of color. Yes,
yes,
there you go.
Because some of the recommendations could impact other communities. Now, we were not so arrogant to believe that our recommendations were the end all and beat all for all minority groups, and we recognize that. And so, we didn't put it in writing, but we communicated to the board that this was focused primarily on Black Americans, although it impacts others, but we need to invite other people of color to express themselves and identify concerns so that we can help them grow, develop, and so forth. So, one of my chief objectives was to have recommendations about how we can engage more minorities in ASHP, and for them to really identify ASHP as their professional home, a place to go to be supported, a place to go to get resources to help them with their career development and their professional development and things of that nature. And so that was my primary goal. But we touched on so many other things as well. Um, when I first cycled onto the board, because of some of the discussions that we were having within the college about pipeline for minority faculty, one of the uh, concerns was, where's our pipeline for clinical faculty? And recognizing that some of our faculty have done fellowship and residency training and things of that nature, from ASHP's perspective, I was concerned about, what does the pipeline look like for minority students into residency and then into clinical practice and faculty roles? And ASHP really didn't have that data. And for various and sundry reasons, there were concerns about, whether that information should be collected. If we collected it, what to do with it? Might it prejudice decisions about, residency candidacies and things of that sort? So we worked with their legal department and were able to come up with a strategy for collecting that demographic information so that we know how many minority students, people of color, by self-identification, are going into, are applying for residencies, they're getting residencies, and hopefully, completing residencies. And so we're starting to gather that kind of information. And that was another one of my goals. We need better information about who our constituency is, how many identify as minority, regardless of what that minority is, and how can we do better to enhance the number of minorities in residency training programs. And so those are my two objectives. But as I mentioned, we touched on a lot of different things that I think are really important to where ASHP needs to go as an organization.
Well, as a dean of a College of Pharmacy, I'm interested in how many can we get into the College of Pharmacy and then graduate successfully so they can get into those residencies. It makes a lot of sense that ASHP would be interested in residencies because ASHP runs the residency program, for those in the audience that don't know that that's how that goes. And as long as I'm speaking to the audience, if you've got questions, feel free to use the Q&A form or a chat form and send me questions. We'd like Dr. Walker to answer whatever you've got. One of the things that I noticed about the task force is that they were focused in that you didn't consider gender identity, sexual preference, some of these other diversity issues that are brought up. This is really, as you said, about race.
That's correct. That was the focus. It was for race. But I would say that ASHP has addressed and continues to address the needs of individuals that identify as LGBT from a number of different perspectives. And so
there's healthcare disparities there, for as an example.
Absolutely. There are disparities.
Yeah.
There are disparities, but the task force was focused specifically on race.
Right. And okay, so we've sent the link out to the audience so they can see some of the draft, at least of that. Were there particular ones that were controversial or more discussed than others? You want to share with us kind of what some of the good behind the scenes discussion so we can be the fly on the wall in the room?
Well, I think the one that engendered the most discussion was number 11. And in the draft, you'll see that it references the Rooney Rule, which is a rule that is used in professional football to try to increase the number of minority candidates who are interviewed for coaching positions and such. The comments questioned the success of the Rooney Rule in football. I am not a football fan, so I can't even begin to address that point. But that was one of the controversial ones. And, some of the sites, the individuals who provided comment pointed out that their HR departments would have a problem with that recommendation. And so based on that feedback, the task force thought through a better way to approach the issue and what we could actually do to support health systems to diversify the residency candidacy pools, as well as pharmacist and pharmacist leadership positions as well. We didn't just focus on residency, but we focused on the pharmacy workforce. And there are some specific recommendations about pharmacist leaders. So that could be the chief executive pharmacy officer or directors of pharmacy and so forth. So the Rooney Rule is no longer in the recommendations. That was probably the most controversial one. And the language of the current draft deals with helping our constituents remove implicit bias or limit implicit bias in their hiring processes. And so there's plenty of resources that we can appoint people to. And we encourage them to include implicit bias education for their staffs who are engaged in the hiring processes.
So I was impressed that ASHP came up with I think pretty strong recommendations and guidelines, and I haven't seen the final. I've only seen this draft, but it's really it wasn't a shrinking violet sort of set of rules. I mean, they came out and they made their statement, and I thought that was wonderful. I'm wondering, realistically, when are we going to see an impact of this?
Well, within the organization, we're seeing some impact right now. Under the guidance or the recommendations pertaining to governance of the organization, the committees on nomination for the national officers, i.e. the board of directors, the treasurer, the presidential officers, as well as the committees on nominations for our councils and other work groups, if you will. The recommendation is for 2021 to make some changes to broaden the pool of individuals eligible to serve in those capacities and to do what we can to diversify the appointments and the slates of candidates. So that's one change that's already in the works. We have made recommendations for including or increasing the diversity of individuals who receive awards from ASHP. And so the awards committee is already working on some of those recommendations. So some of them that we could implement quickly are in the works. Others, it's going to take longer for us to get them into place. But one of the things that I'm really pushing for our board to do is to implement an accountability process so that we get regular reports on how we are progressing towards the recommendations. What data do we need to prove we're making an impact? And let's start collecting those data.
All right.
So that's
good.
where
we're running short on time, but I got questions rolling in here. So, and I'd also like to see, so it sounds like it would be a good time to be a BIPOC person coming into pharmacy. And that I'm really hopeful that this is going to open some doors and some opportunities that maybe should have existed, not maybe, should have existed before, but didn't for whatever reason. Let's drill this down to maybe the student pharmacists who are in this audience as an example. For example, if we have current students who are in this audience and they want to get involved in this kind of movement or move it forward, like what could they do? What are there student organizations? Are there other things that they can do to be getting involved? What informed you? What got you into this role?
Well, let me talk about what they might be able to do now rather than, I'm an old guy.
Okay. Besides, you didn't go to, like me, you didn't go to Michigan either. So let's talk today.
No, the earth was still cooling when I graduated. So, there are two things that I would encourage students to do with regard to professional organizations. We do have a student health system chapter at Michigan, and other schools have them as well. Some of these recommendations that are relevant to students will be pushed out to our student forum, and from the student forum be pushed down to our student organizations across the country. And we're also pushing the recommendations out to our state affiliates to work with them so that we have a common direction and a common goal, if you will, for our state affiliates, so that we're all on the same page pushing this agenda forward. And so students can engage in the college level chapters as well as the state level chapters to engage in some of this work to help roll out their recommendations.
And just to, because we're really running short on time, if there's any last questions, audience, please type it in quickly. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, what can the college do?
Well, I've already had lots of conversations with Regina about these kinds of things. I'm working with our DEI committee, and I think some of these recommendations should be vetted through the committee to talk about what we as a college might be able to do to advance this agenda. We're really interested in increasing the numbers of BIPOC students that are enrolled in colleges of pharmacy. We're really interested in making sure that there is a professional mentoring process for them to help them to continue to be successful. And ASHP does have a mentoring program. One of our recommendations is for them to revamp their program to make sure that it addresses not only the needs of majority students, but the needs of minority students as well as minority practitioners. And so more to come on that, but we will be sharing the recommendations with our DEI committee.
Excellent. And we'll look to implement all of them if we can possibly do it, and as soon as possible. I think that'd be great. Well, Dean Walker, that's all the time we've got. It goes so fast when we're talking about something exciting, and this is really cutting edge stuff. And so I want to thank you for being part of the program and coming on and explaining ASHP's initiative.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we have, and if there's questions for you, by the way, I've got the contact information up on the screen right now for Dean Walker, pcwalker@umich.edu. And he'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And I think email is probably the best way to get him, because if you go down to his office in the garden level of the college pharmacy, he's probably not there because he's working from home as am I. The next seminar we're going to have is Thursday, March 25th at 5:30. We're going to have Bruce Chaffee, who is a graduate of the program, works over at Michigan Medicine. But really, I invited Bruce on because he is a person who does pharmacy informatics. And I think if you're interested in job security, you need to be thinking about pharmacy informatics. And he can talk to you about, and you can have a lot of questions about, what is this as a career? What does it look like going forward? Is it just working on a computer, or is it really making a difference with patients' health? And so I invite you to come February 25th at 5:30. Thanks for being part of the audience, and thanks again to Dean Walker. Good night.